we think of this catalog as ideally a kind of canon for progress, both in a very sort of explicit sense when it comes to, again, growing the GDP of the internet, making it much easier for people who have very ambitious ideas about a company they want to build to do that in an easier way than they might have to do if they were just trying to figure out everything themselves. You don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to the Asia Tech Podcast. We are joined today by Tamara Winter, the commissioning editor of Stripe Press. Tamara, thank you so much for coming on the show. I got it right, didn't I?
Sort of. Tamara.
No, correct me then, because I want to make your dad happy.
Yeah, Tamara. Yes, Tamara. That's right, because there's like three pronunciations. There's Tamara for anybody who watched Tia and Tamara. Then there's Tamara for anybody outside of the US. Then there's Tamara, which as far as I can see is just my dad.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I always say this to people before we start recording. I want to know how to pronounce your name because even I want to get it right. I want to try. And the reason why is because, like I said before we started, your parents made like an active choice to pick a name that they really loved and they kind of bestowed it on you and gave it to you. And they don't want other people just to muck it up and guess. Do you know what I mean?
I totally agree. And I grew up in a part of Texas where it was quite heavy with immigrants in Dallas. And you get used to at some point, and this wasn't necessarily my issue because my name is just Tamara. It's pretty easy to pronounce.
Right.
But you get used to this thing where people will kind of either Americanize their names or pick entirely new names because it's difficult for people to pronounce. And what I love about, I guess, the past few years is that it's become, I think, particularly after Game of Thrones, it's like if you can pronounce Daenerys, you can pronounce this other name.
So I'm so glad you said this because I lived in Japan. So I've lived in Asia since 1990 and I lived in Japan for 22 years. And I worked with guys whose names are like Haruo, not that hard to pronounce.
Exactly.
But he was like, never mind. I'm just going to call myself Harry so people in the rest of the world can say my name. And it always disappointed me because I was like, that's not your name though.
That's right.
Do you know what I mean?
And I always hate or that's a really strong word, but I always feel very disappointed when I learn that I've been mispronouncing somebody's name and they don't correct me.
And they didn't tell me.
And I think it's so important. That's your name. People should not mispronounce your name. And it's not like an inconvenience for somebody to call you the name that you were given.
At least try.
Right.
Anyway, I don't want to dwell on this, but I can't believe I messed it up after all.
No, don't worry about it.
I'll try to get it right at the end. Okay. Before we jump into the main part of our conversation, let's give our listeners a little bit of your background for some context.
Sure. So I think for the purposes of this conversation, so as you said, I'm the current commissioning editor at Stripe Press. And what that essentially means is that I spend most of my time thinking about what comes next in the catalog, the future of the catalog. So Stripe Press is the publishing imprint of Stripe. We're a global technology company dually based in San Francisco and in Dublin. And our whole goal is to, our mission is to grow the GDP of the internet, but we create economic infrastructure for companies that want to start, scale, and grow really sophisticated businesses, typically on the internet, but increasingly, everything is kind of omni-channel. And so I am the commissioning editor of Stripe Press. We've published 15 books to date. We have two parts of our catalog. One part of our catalog is called our turpentine books. Now, those are the books that are quite practical in nature. And we'll get into this a little bit further afterwards.
Yep.
The other side of our catalog is our provocations. And so, we chose those names very intentionally. And so now, before I was working at Stripe, I've always had a deep interest in economics and specifically in why some countries and economies grow faster than others. I was born in Nigeria. I grew up in Texas, as I told you. Yes, I was born in Lagos, Nigeria.
Cool.
I only lived there for 2 months, which is long enough to get all the inconveniences of not having been a native-born American, but not long enough to get any of the cool stuff, like my dad's accent.
Of being Nigerian.
So people always, and it's like, you don't really count. And I'm like, well, it took me much longer to get my driver's license because of it. So, tell that to the DMV.
Exactly.
But so that's my background. And before Stripe, I was
So
working.
can I ask you this?
Sure.
Can I ask you this, though? So if Stripe is, as you say, it's the payment infrastructure for the internet and frankly for off the internet as well,
That's right?
As this omni-channel and online to offline and offline to online kind of merge into one thing. I look at all of Stripe's products and I get it. But what's the point of the Stripe Press? Like, what was what John and Patrick were sitting around one day and said, we need to have our own press. We need to be our own
Sure.
publisher. Like, why? Why?
Well, I get this question a lot. And I
Yeah.
think I'm going to answer this, but I think before we talk about why Stripe Press, it's helpful to know something about who we're talking to, right? So for many publishers, the sort of total addressable market is anybody who reads books. Ours is, I think, much more clinical than that. So the people that we're talking to very much resemble Stripe's user base, right? So these are people who our audience tends to be very global, very high agency, very curious, and people who are working in some form or another to push and advance the frontier of human knowledge and capability. So many of them
Fair
will
enough.
be founders, others will be execs, other technologists, but it's a pretty wide audience too. So then within that, you also get academics, policymakers, and so on. Now,
Okay.
when Stripe was created, I just mentioned to you that I was born in Nigeria. Now,
Yep.
for a founder who was trying to start a company in Nigeria, it takes, just guess about how long it takes just to register a business.
So I live in Thailand.
Sure.
So I'm not sure it's that different. It's probably faster in Nigeria, to be fair. I don't know, 6 months?
Right. So 9 months, about 2/3 of a year.
9 months, fair enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
about half of your per capita income. And when you try to say that to somebody who is like I am, I live in New York now, based in New York, it sounds
Yep.
like entrepreneurship is some sort of a scam. And you think about the fact that data is very expensive in many parts of the world. It's just full of friction and fees. So huge expenses in time and money. The reason for Stripe to be started is that's no way we want to increase the GDP of the internet. It simply should not take you 2/3 of a year just to start your business, right?
No.
That to me is just absurd. That's why Stripe was founded. Similarly, if you're a founder, let's say you're in San Francisco, it's hard enough to get access to the sort of top founders, executives, investors, to get capital from them or time from them. It's hard enough if you're in San Francisco. It's that much harder if you are anywhere else in the world. And so while we think our main contribution to increasing human prosperity and increasing the GDP of the internet will be through our product, the second and key way that we do that is by disseminating ideas that we think are important. So I told you about the turpentine side of our catalog, and you can feel free to interrupt me at any time here.
I want to make a point about Atlas, right? Because I do think that it's actually really important for people to understand that you're not just saying we want to make it easier by giving a better way for them to make payments, but there's an entire infrastructure around startup incorporation as well that says, even if you're in Lagos, even if you're in Bangkok, we have a way for you to set up a corporation. I don't know if it's a C Corp.
It's a C Corp.
I can't remember.
In Delaware. That's right.
Yep. In Delaware, right? So that's the place where everybody's going to want to set up their companies anyway. I just wanted to be clear that you're not just talking about it, but there's actually a product there that does that for you. So you can go from 9 months to 3 days. I forget how long Atlas takes, but it's pretty fast.
Exactly, Michael. And this is one of the things that drew me to Stripe in the first place, because a lot of people talk in very philosophical terms about, easing the process of entrepreneurship. But Atlas is a very concrete way that we do that. And it's incredible to talk to people like, for example, everybody, all anybody wants to talk about is AI.
Right.
Just headquartered not too far from us in New York is a company called Runway, which I'm sure you'll have heard of. They're an ML company for video creation. They now, I don't know how many companies can say that they've contributed to an Oscar for Everything Everywhere All at Once. So not just any movie, right?
Right.
Every single one of the founders, they have 3 founders, were born outside of the US. They used Atlas to incorporate. Now they use Stripe for lots of other things. But I love that you pointed that out, because I think for a lot of people who have never had to think about things like a months-long waiting time between filing to incorporate your company and actually getting it, it's very hard to make that concrete for people. Well, nobody starts their company knowing how to constitute a board or knowing how to think about product market fit, right?
How to start a company.
And in fact, right, I think the OpenAI saga, some months ago showed us that even people who have been around the block in entrepreneurship terms
don't know how to
don't
do
necessarily. and so
And Sam, so that, are you listening?
Well, and in fact, Sam, who is, I think, fantastic, he is one of the interviewees in our very first book, High Growth Handbook. And so it all kind of comes full circle.
I want to get back to something else you said about why some countries grow faster. So I studied economics as well, and I've lived outside of my home country, and I've lived in Southeast Asia now for almost 13 years. So I've lived in a developing country, another developing country, and now I live in, two developed countries and now developing countries,
That's
right?
right.
And I wonder as well, like, why does Thailand grow slower than the United States, right? Why is Singapore growing so fast and yet Malaysia is less fast since they used to be the same country? And I wonder, from your perspective, right, if you think that having products like Atlas and all the other products that are part of Stripe that say, you know what, if you can't do it in your country, we can do it on the internet, right? That's that infrastructure you're talking about that's getting built or that's built. Do you think at some point those countries are going to have to change the way they operate because so many people internally are now building companies remotely and then not even repatriating capital? So they're completely leaving themselves out and giving the benefits to the established companies and countries already when they could do it themselves.
I love that you asked that because just this morning I was chatting with a woman called Sarah, who's I'm in Singapore right now, so we're chatting from Singapore,
Yep.
which people may not know.
Yep.
And she works for OpenGov, which is part of GovTech in Singapore. And she was
In
telling
Singapore.
me about how they actually have been, when it comes to a lot of the work that they do is about how governments can integrate technology and use data in more interesting and sort of incisive ways. And what was so interesting is that their biggest collaborators are, in fact, not the US and the UK like you would expect, but other emerging economies. Not that Singapore is an emerging economy, but emerging economies. So they just came back from
Yeah.
Ethiopia. And there they met some folks from Rwanda. They've spoken a lot with the government of Cambodia. And it's so interesting to me because I think what you're finding is the internet has this democratizing effect where, it used to be that if you weren't in San Francisco, right? So you could have been in Garland, Texas, where I grew up. Forget it. There's no way that you're meeting an Arthur Rock who's going to finance your startup. And what we've seen at Stripe, and certainly I think other companies will bear this out, is that increasingly it's not like the end all be all being located in this 30 square mile area of San Francisco.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think you do see countries really kind of feeling that competition. And nobody wants to see really talented, sharp people. Everybody wants to many people, right? They want to be able to build a company like Stripe right where they are, right?
Yeah.
Saying that somebody needs to move to San Francisco to be able to, build a company of Stripe scale is, first of all, unsustainable.
Yep.
And second of all, we know, at least now, right, the trends are showing people are sort of leaving the US, or they're feeling less pressure to have to be in the US or London or where have you to build a really successful and robust company. But the part that you pointed out was the competition. That is what's so interesting. So when I was working on charter cities, I would kind of keep track of things like what governments are kind of making overtures to people to come move there. Finland,
Right.
Finland had their sort of year-long search for people to move to Finland, and then after COVID, they had like Helsinki in a box, which you could apply to get Helsinki in a box. You see not just but in Saudi, you see. African tech. It's so interesting to see the competition, not only between, it used to be the US is like competing, Nigeria is competing with the US for their talent. Now it's, if I'm a talented engineer in Africa, I can go to Egypt, I can go to Kenya, I can go to Rwanda, I can go to Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa. And so it's just a really exciting thing to see all this regional competition and collaboration for that matter.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And if you could go back, I think it's like 65 years to the founding of Singapore, right? When it was, 60 years.
When it was kicked out of Malaysia, that's right.
Yeah, and when it was just like a fishing village. And if you had predicted to me or to anybody back then that it would have the highest GDP per capita almost in the world, but definitely in the region for sure, nobody would have believed you. But what they've built there is something pretty cool. But what they first had to do is go to other countries and find like the best little pieces of every system that they had there, implement them there in a really interesting way. And then 30 years later or 40 years later, the UAE actually came to Singapore and said, we want to build the DIFC, right?
That's right.
The Dubai International Financial Center, we wanted to say, who's the model for this? And they went to Singapore, learned a lot, took back, and then of course they customized it because the UAE is not Singapore.
That's
there are
right.
differences there. And what's even cooler is, and only because you brought up Rwanda, is that Rwanda and Burundi together have kind of gotten together, at least in my reading, and have gone to Dubai and said, we want to build the DIFC here.
That's right.
And they want to, like, now they're passing from Singapore to Dubai into Africa. And I'll tell you what, it's scary because once that happens, I know there are 51 countries in Africa,
That's
but
right.
it's still 1 point something billion people, 1.2, 1.4 billion people. And, that continent's getting its stuff together. And there's venture capitalists in Egypt and in South Africa. And once they start investing in Nigeria and in Ethiopia and in Kenya, I think the world forgets how resource rich the whole continent
in
is.
Nigeria too, for that matter, right? Aboyeji, who's one of my he's one of my inspirations. He co-founded Andela and Flutterwave. How many people can say they've co-founded one sort of wildly successful company versus two? He has the Africa Future Fund, and he's very invested in just kind of really seeding Africa's tech ecosystem. It's just so promising. Something.
Yeah.
So when I was working on charter cities, there was sort of a common thought when it came to, can you build cities from scratch? And everybody wants to study Hong Kong, Singapore, Shenzhen, and Dubai very carefully. And the more I spent time in the ecosystem, the more I appreciated how little I actually knew about each of those companies or countries, and in Shenzhen's case, cities, and how they became successful. I think particularly in America, and particularly people who are in economics, so I'm going to tell on ourselves for a bit, there is just a complete lack of nuance and willingness to kind of complicate the story. Just in, let's take Dubai's case, right? Dubai had its first bridges, airport, road, port, all of these things before they ever found a drop of oil. And when they did find oil, they had much less of it than their neighbors. And so people will look at somewhere like a Dubai and try and kind of pinpoint the causes of success. This is what ends up being quite tricky about economics. In the end, it's very difficult to answer the question in any sort of succinct way about why some places grow faster than others. What we do know is that institutions seem to be a really meaningful part of the puzzle. And so when you look in the case of Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dubai, all of these places thought very carefully about their institutions. And it's funny because I spent a lot of time in Zambia working on charter cities, and we got to go to the Zambian central bank, which, a story for another time or maybe for later in this conversation. But we spoke a lot about them visiting Shenzhen. And what you will learn is that Africa is littered with special economic zones. They are truly all across the continent. But a special economic zone is exactly, you wouldn't know because it's, that lot of good, as the central bank governor said, that it's done us. And and it's very interesting because we went to the Lusaka East Special Economic Zone. I met a woman called Monica who, her company is called Java Foods. They basically create fortified foods. And she'd worked in Nigeria for a long time. She was back in her native Zambia. She wanted to set up her business and her factory in the Lusaka East Special Economic Zone. And it didn't have any power. So it has no taxes, it has no special visas, a special banking regime, but no power. And so I think there's a real danger in trying to overlearn the lessons of Singapore, Shenzhen, Dubai, Hong Kong, or any place without really kind of, as you said, thinking very carefully about which institutions matter and how to kind of really mix and match the things that matter. It's so fun that we get to talk about this because it's been so long since I've gotten to be really steeped in this literature. I guess for anybody who's listening, the book that I was referring to about Dubai is a book called City of Gold. And it's an excellent one. And of course, when it comes to Singapore, you kind of have to read from third world to first. But certainly you don't want to stop there. Because as I said, when people talk about Singapore in the US, it's similar to when we talk about Scandinavia. There's just I don't know, there's just a real lack of nuance.
For sure. So, find it on a map. I'm sure that I could go to anybody in the United States, not anybody, but mostly anybody, and just go find it on the map.
That's right.
Anyway, I like the fact that you brought this back to books because my mind is racing trying to, provocations, I think I understand.
That's right.
We'll get to that second, but turpentine, what does that mean?
Yeah, so turpentine is based on a Pablo Picasso quote. And he says that when art critics get
You're
together,
way too smart for me. Go ahead.
well, I just have been a bookworm my whole life, which
I can
has
tell.
been fun, but I'm sure it was like exhausting for my dad. We had this sort of ritual where he gets USA Today and it's stolen within the week. And, you know, maybe he finds it again and maybe it's got like taffy on it by the time he gets it back or something. Right. Growing up, my favorite person was like truly Wolf Blitzer. If you're African, you grew up with CNN on. So it's like Wolf Blitzer, Christian Amanpour, etc.
Yeah.
But the turpentine part of our catalog, so when Pablo Picasso said that when art critics get together, they talk about lofty ideals like form and structure and meaning. But when artists get together, they just talk about where to get cheap turpentine. They care about sort of the practical stuff. And so when we started Stripe Press, the big focus, as we talked about earlier, is that if you are somebody who's coming to one of these books, you're building a fast growing company, you simply don't have time to sort through a bunch of fluffy stuff to get to what you actually want to know about product market fit, about hiring, about whatever. And so we have a couple of books in that vein in our catalog. High Growth Handbook, our very first book, which I love that book. It was written by Alad Gill, who was an early Stripe investor. Alad is he is representative of my favorite type of turpentine author. When we're looking for those authors, we're typically thinking about when we think about this subject, who is the person to write this book? Alad Gill is one such author. He was early at Google. He was a VP at Twitter. He's co-founded several companies, and he has invested in something like 40 to 50 unicorns. And so many of the fastest growing companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, but increasingly elsewhere, rely on Alad and his excellent expertise. He'd written a blog for years about different facets of building a company. And he came to John Collison one day and they were having lunch, and Alad mentioned to John that he was putting a book together based on his long running series of essays. And John said, well, give it to us. We'll put it together in a book. We'll call it, I don't know, Stripe Press. And that's how Stripe Press was born. And it's so important that it was that book because it was instantly the feedback that we got with a book like that. You're not reading it for fun, right? Because it's all about the discipline of scaling a startup. So it's going to be everything from, what to do now that you've got product market fit, how to acquire customers, how to constitute your board, how to think about things like your exit. Are you going to have a merger? Are you going to go public? Are you going to get acquired? And it's littered with interviews with folks like Hemant Taneja, Paul Graham, Patrick Collison, Sam Altman, Mark Andreessen, Claire Hughes Johnson. I'll pause on Claire Hughes Johnson because she's the author of our latest turpentine book, which we can get into, but I'll just pause there for a second.
I want to make a metaphor for you, and I want to see if you agree with this, right? Because you said something that's really important to me, that most founders don't have time to sort through a bunch of things and find the information that's relevant to them.
That's right.
And I want to make the reverse, not case, because I agree with that completely, but a reverse statement that says that that's the biggest problem for most startups to begin with. Because what you're talking about is discovery. How do I discover the things that are important? And I think for most founders, the idea for them is not how do I raise money? How do I find product market fit? I would argue with people about this. What I would say is your biggest problem is how do people discover you? And I'm not talking about pure marketing. I'm really talking about discovery. And I think it's really great that you made that point because at the core of just like trying to learn something is just how do I even find out what I need to learn?
That's right.
Right?
It's so funny you say this.
And that's why I love that statement.
There was a tweet I saw the other day about how can you tell somebody is a really, really excellent high IQ, not in the sort of number sense, but like how do you know you're dealing with somebody who's incredibly sharp? And multiple people made the same point, referring to folks that they had worked with. It's people who can, in very few questions, drill down to the essential heart of a particular issue or of a matter. Core. And you see this often with not just successful one-time founders, but multiple time successful founders. And, let's just move on past founders, really, really effective operators as well. Yeah. You know when you're in a meeting with them and they are able to relatively quickly take from chaos, ambiguity, what have you, and figure out very quickly what the actual crux of whatever the issue is. And it's an excellent thing to behold. And we hope that our books are just that all the way through, right? So we don't need to kind of convince you of the importance of entrepreneurship or convince you that you should have managers or that you should hire in a thoughtful way. We assume that you've
Right.
got all of that, and now let's give you the actual substance that you're looking for.
I want to ask you something else. I remember when my brother was in medical school, and this is, God, it has to be 30 years ago now.
So you and I are both
said to
the
him,
sibling that didn't go to medical school. Is that?
and believe me, I'm still hearing about it.
Well, okay. My sister graduates in 2 weeks, and I'm sure.
Congratulations
Yeah, I'm sure
to her, I guess.
Right. Congratulations. In a way, congratulations to us. I feel like we all went through medical school. Yeah. We all deserve congratulations.
Exactly. But I remember talking to him, and I said, wouldn't it be cool if instead of like carrying around that clipboard that doctors carry with them, that was just a digital representation of all this stuff. And every time you went into the room, it just NFC knew. I didn't know the NFC chip, but just knew where you were and who was in the room and stuff like that. And you could just have all their information with you at all times. It would be so much easier to search for stuff. You're not flipping through pages. And he said something really interesting. Well, he said two things really interesting to me. He said, that's never going to happen. So he's not as into tech as I am. But he also said, doctors want to touch the paper. They want to write it down themselves. They want to remember. And I'm curious why, in the age of like everything being digital, and I'm serious about this, right? With Stripe itself being like a digitally native company, why you decided that it was a good idea to print books out.
That's right. I think that books are among the oldest technologies. And every time I say that, somebody will roll their eyes. But you think about it like...
No, I agree.
And they endure. Every book is a story between the author and the reader, right? And books are one of the best ways that we have of storytelling and speaking across generations, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I was just doing something, a fireside chat in Sydney last week. And my interlocutor said, the first thing I did when I got this book, he's holding one of our books, was smell it. I just think,
I get it.
Do you smell your books?
I get it.
I have never once smelled a book.
It's like getting into a new car, though.
That's so interesting.
The greatest thing about a new car is not like the speed and all that stuff. It's like going, this is new. This is new. It's like fresh paint.
Well, you just answered your own question.
I smell every book, but I do. Yeah. No, I agree. But I want to know why.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I'm 30 years older than the founders of Stripe, right? So for me, a book is the way that I read and learned everything. And I can't read a digital book. I've tried, but there's no way to do all the things that I like to do with a book on a Kindle or whatever the book reader is. You can't do the same thing. You know what I mean? You can't fold the paper down. You can't put an ace of spades in to like lock the page. Like you can't do any of this stuff. It's not nearly as fun, but I want to know why you did it.
I think that we think that these ideas are timeless. Don't they deserve a presentation that suits that? And so at that point, it's more than just for us. And I love this question, right? Because we do two physical products. One is terminal or point of sale device. And then the other is Stripe Press books. And what we're saying, right, like, is that if you take this book, right, you need to know how to do something. You need to know how to scale an internal function. You want to think of in a sort of systematic way about engineering management, whatever. That deserves not just a physical presentation, but a beautiful physical presentation. People always say, you can't judge a book by its cover. You shouldn't. Well, you actually can with ours.
You can,
and you can think of the sort of the time that went into design these books as like a down payment on your time for reading it. It's just important for us to give the ideas a package that we think suits them. And it's so interesting because this is how it used to be when you published books, right? And it used to be far more expensive. So there's far less reason today to publish, ugly or cheap books.
Well, to not publish a book, yeah?
That's right. And I think it's very interesting because in technology, we're always focused on what's new, what's coming next, kind of pushing the curve ahead. But I think with books, they've always been about what's enduring, things that don't change, things that are relevant in more than 10 years. And us choosing not only to have our books in physical form, but in hardcover form is our way of telling you in sort of a very expensive way that we think that this is worth you keeping. It's worth you treating as an artifact. It's important. The sort of side effect of this is that you have people who... we call them Stripe Press shelfies. I would say, there's some it's not zero. Some part of our readership that just simply likes having beautiful books around for what it signals to other people. And so
Yeah,
so more than
exactly.
once I've ended up in a conversation with somebody who's been super eager to show me their Stripe Press shelfie. And then you ask them what their favorite book in the catalog is, and they'll say, "Oh,
No idea.
well,
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I'm
no
like,
idea.
but can we be mad
The
at
blue
them?
one.
Can we be mad at them? And right. And I actually, somebody once said that, and I was like, well, we have 5 blue books, so it could be any of them.
How does this work though? So for the books that you don't publish yourself,
Sure.
like, because I looked at the list of books, right? All of them are not being published by Stripe Press. They're just books that have existed that maybe you or the team thinks are important. How do you get the rights to them? What are the mechanics there for that? And
It's
why
such
do you publish
inside
them when they're
baseball.
already available?
Yeah, it's such inside baseball, right? Well,
Inside me.
we think of this catalog as ideally a kind of canon for progress, both in a very sort of explicit sense when it comes to, again, growing the GDP of the internet, making it much easier for people who have very ambitious ideas about a company they want to build to do that in an easier way than they might have to do if they were just trying to figure out everything themselves. You don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yep.
But on the other side, this idea of provocations, almost everything is upstream or downstream rather of ideas, right? So the other part of
Yes.
why Stripe Press exists is that we think at the heart of great companies, great institutions, and lasting companies and institutions are ideas. This isn't to say that ideas are the only input, right? There are things like agency, ethics, there's all sorts of context that matters. But upstream of everything else is just what you believe about the world, right?
Yeah.
And so when we think about publishing, part of what we're trying to do, and part of what I'm trying to do when I'm sifting through all the potential reprints in particular, is what do we
Right.
think is important enough that, again, we told you the people we're talking to specifically are these very curious. We can assume they are globally minded. We can assume they are extremely high agency. What do we think that they should internalize as part of their worldview? That will lead us to books like, for example, The Art of Doing Science and Engineering. Now, that book was written by Richard Hamming. He, among other things, was a central figure at Bell Labs. He then went to the Los Alamos, and he also is a computer science pioneer. He invented Hamming code, so you can think of him alongside folks like Claude Shannon. And that book was his textbook at his last gig in his life, which was as a professor at the Naval Postgraduate Academy. And among other things, it's one part unorthodox memoir, one part manual for how to think, how to develop patterns of thought that are correct, right thinking. It's so funny. In the US, we're constantly having this conversation. I don't have to tell you, you're American, about the quality of our education system. What are they really learning? Is anybody learning to, how to learn?
To think.
And in
How to
fact,
learn.
the subtitle of that book is The Art of Doing Science and Engineering, Learning to Learn. The very last chapter of that book is a very famous essay called You and Your Research. And it's all about how to ask the right questions about your life, how to keep your door open, as it were, intellectually. At Bell Labs, what he noticed is that the scientists who kept their doors open were much more likely to end up being the authors or discoverers of particularly important innovations because they were much more likely to cross-pollinate with somebody else.
Somebody else was much more likely just to walk into their office and say, "What are you working on?" Because the thing I'm working on, I'm stuck. Maybe I just want to change what I'm thinking about, and I can just talk to you. And then the guy leaves and goes, "That's what I was waiting for."
It's ideas bumping into each other. What is innovation but that, right? And obviously, you want to give yourself more shots on goal. And so that book, Richard Hamming he died in the early 90s, right? So there was nobody, and he died without children. So with a book like that, it was a particularly interesting one because it was very difficult to figure out who owned the rights. It turns out that book is what we call an orphan book. Nobody really knows who owns the rights to it. There's no clear claim to it. But if you went to go try and buy that book off of Amazon, it was like $1,000 before we published it. So sometimes it's very easy for us to make the decision. It clearly has value. There's a sort of fundamentally important message there. And it's incredibly expensive. And so there's a bit of a meme now where if there's a book you love that's out of print and it's like $700, just tweet it at Stripe Press, at Patrick, at John, and we'll see what we can do for you. That's one way, right? Another is just
I love it.
Books that we just think should be more widely disseminated. Books like Where's My Flying Car? You know, when we think about, for example, climate change, there are just competing schools of thought. So one of the ways that we view Stripe Press is a sort of expression of our values in the world. And one of those values is that, in fact, big, crunchy problems are tractable, and often they are not impossible. And there's a huge leap of world of difference between something that is impossible and something that is improbable. And people who do very important things in the world tend to live in that chasm, right? And so Where's My Flying Car is a different way to think about the climate crisis, which is very real. You know, one school of thought is that we ought to just succumb to degrowth, that we ought to impose austerity on ourselves. And it gets particularly pernicious when we think about what emerging economies ought to do, because there's quite a lot of scolding that happens.
Yeah, let's have you guys stay poor while we have polluted for the last 100 years. Like that doesn't feel like the right solution.
Our industrial revolution, not for you.
Yeah, you don't get to participate in that.
That's
feels like the wrong idea.
And it's icky. It hits everybody's ears wrong. And maybe most importantly, it doesn't even work. Whereas a different framing is that we ought to be thinking about abundant energy. And in fact, you know, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, our energy intensity, which is the amount of energy, you know, a civilization would consume, was increasing pretty steadily, 7% per annum, until about 1971. And so Josh Storrs Hall, who is the author of that book, spends the entirety of Where's My Flying Car trying to answer that question. Where is my flying car? Why did we somehow get off track in terms of growth in 1971? And how might we recover that future that we were promised? And so with that book, he self-published, and we just reached out to him. Often the way that we will select books is by cultivating, if our author is still living, cultivating relationships with them.
Yeah.
It's all very relationship based because I can't throw the same amount of cash that a Penguin Random House or a Simon & Schuster would be able to. So our hands are tied. But
also you're publishing different books, and you actually have a reason. Like if you go, and again, nothing against Penguin or Random House at all, but they don't have a thesis, right?
Or they have a bunch of theses, right? And so they have like a million different imprints, but I totally understand what you're saying, and I completely agree.
Right. Like I think I wrote it down, like there's a reason why you're doing this, right? You're trying to, for these high agency, very busy founder style people and very high level thinkers, you want to give them, just go, don't even look anywhere else. Just come here and read these books, because these are going to be the most effective way to learn the things that we're pretty sure you want to learn, and then everybody else likes you want to learn. And sure, Penguin publishes great books and Random House, they all publish great books, but I don't know which ones, right? They're ruining my discovery problem, which we talked about earlier. That was the only point I'm trying to make.
No, I totally agree with you. And it's
nothing against them,
about. No, and in fact, one of the people I most admire in publishing is an editor at Penguin, a woman called Bria Sanford, and she edits. Yep. But it's interesting because she edits two very specific imprints, one called Sentinel and one called Thesis. And she, in fact, has a very exactly. And Thesis is in fact
very familiar to me,
right? And so it is interesting. We kind of try and stay in our lane, so to speak. But I think you just pointed out a really interesting issue, which is a much larger one that you see across just the world of, let's just call it content. We think very carefully when we're selecting a book, because I think if you make things, it is your responsibility not to add to the amount of clutter and like mediocrity in the world.
I won't do it.
You know?
I'd rather do nothing.
Right.
Yeah, I'd rather do nothing than
mediocrity.
mediocrity.
And so we ship, in fact, many fewer books than our peers do, because we would rather publish one book a year that we feel very strongly is worth your time. It's the only thing you can't get back, than to publish, 30 books of middling quality just to,
I don't want to be the Mark Kostabi of like book publishing.
Who is that? Who is that?
You should look it up when we're talking. But Mark Kostabi was this artist in like the 80s who was just like, all of my art stinks. The whole art world stinks. And I'm just going to paint this stuff. And the more he said that he was just going to be prolific and make really terrible art, the more people wanted to buy it. And it was still terrible and mediocre. But he was just like a really great salesperson. But I don't want to be that. I
Exactly.
agree with you. I'd rather put out like one podcast a year that was just killer good than 1,000 that were just like meh.
But where
It
do you
just
think that comes
that's what I
from?
like to do.
Because this is something I've been having a sort of ongoing conversation with different friends, different mentors about. Is this something that can be taught, this level of
Pride.
sensitivity to, yes,
Yeah.
yes, and an actual sense of shame? Like if you were to ship something that you thought was beneath what you know you're capable of, that you would genuinely feel badly about that? Is that something that
Yeah,
can be
absolutely.
taught?
So
Is that inherent to you?
I
Have you always
think
been like that?
I think so. I think so. And again, I think your surroundings matter. Here's the thing though. Mark Kostabi was specifically trying to go out and earn a ton of money in a
That's
way
right.
that was kind of hucksterish. That was it. That was his goal. My goal, I think, which is very similar to yours, is I want to have a substantive conversation that's going to impact other people's lives in a positive way. Like that's my whole thing. That's why I do what I do. That's why you publish what you publish. You could publish a really salacious book or like some other kind of crazy book and sell millions of them. But why? What would be the point when you go home and talk to your family to just be like, why are you doing that?
It's so funny
Yeah.
that you say this. Just it reminded me of a conversation I was having last week, where my interviewer asked, "Okay, but isn't all of the signaling that you do about quality, isn't that fundamentally just signaling?" And then he mentioned
No.
an anecdote from Steve Jobs. The idea that the inside of the Mac should be as beautiful as the outside, even though no one was seeing it. Isn't that kind of a
Yep.
pointless endeavor? And it's
No.
funny because that anecdote doesn't come from Steve Jobs originally. It's something he learned from his father, who was not, a um, hit making technologist, but in fact an excellent mechanic. And
Yeah.
and so where that story comes from one day is that Steve was painting a fence with his dad, and his dad told him the back side of the fence should be as beautiful as the front side,
Exactly.
even if no one's going to see it. And it matters not because anyone's going to see it, but
No,
because
go ahead.
you'll know.
Exactly.
And
You'll know.
it is an expression of your values and your principles that in fact I did this thing to perfection, and it's not necessarily for somebody else. And for that, I feel very fortunate because I'm surrounded by people
Yeah.
like that, not just at Stripe Press, but within Stripe. I think this is the thing that has distinguished Stripe from anywhere else that I've worked in a very specific way. This idea
I want
that,
to make, yeah, sorry. I want to make another statement, right? Because I think this is really important that the back side of the fence has to look just as good as the front side of the fence, because you'll know. It's the same thing when you say
yes,
like integrity is what you do when no one's around, because, and I'll tell you why, it's not just for the self-satisfaction of doing the right thing. It's because if you get into the habit of cutting corners in any part of your life, when it comes down to a stress point, you'll always cut the corner because that's always been the easiest thing for you to
yes,
do. But if you're never lazy, if you're never lazy, then that also seeps into every other part of your life. So like you make your bed in the morning, you don't put dishes in the sink, you clean them right away.
yes.
Like all these little things matter. And then your whole life is easier and there's no clutter. Getting back to that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I love that. And you didn't interrupt me because I think that's exactly it, right? It's funny because, anything that you do, you can make into like a bit of an idol. Um, and so even as you said, you don't just do it because you want to feel good about yourself, but in fact, it just is true that the way that you do one thing is the way that you do everything. And it's so
Yeah, I
funny
think so.
because I think I've I've just come up on 4 years at Stripe. I was trying to think about um, what I thought was special about it. And I think everybody,
Mm,
often you'll hear people talk about their workplaces and it's like, wow, this is just the most, and especially people who are based in US tech companies are prone
right.
to moralizing about a
A
place,
little bit of
or
exuberance.
yes, a bit of self aggrandizement, if you will. But
Yeah.
what's really interesting about this is just in the culture. This idea that it is just your responsibility not to add to the amount of clutter in the world, and so you see it in every part of the company, from the way that a product announcement will ship
Yep.
to the way that when we redid our new website, the way that they thought about when we launched the new website, this was 2 years ago, there was a spinning globe that we created, and just the amount of time and effort that went into the globe, right? Like how you do one thing truly is just how you do everything, and it's so
I
interesting.
agree.
um, because I think you're so right. When you're surrounded by people for whom that's just the default option, suddenly, your standards start to increase. And I don't know that when I joined Stripe was, I think I've always kind of been sensitive to this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I had, the unreasonably high standards for, what books are worth publishing and reading beforehand. Have you always had, are there things that you have? I know you're supposed to be interviewing here, but I have to know, I've been
No,
asking people
ask
this
me.
recently. What are the things that you have unreasonably high standards for? And my answer, I'll
So,
tell you mine after, but mine is not this particularly lofty thing.
so I always, by the time I kind of get to know somebody really well and they see the way that I work and they see like how detail oriented I am, I say that I'm an unnecessarily serious person. And I can see that it manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. I don't think there's a specific thing where I have really high standards, but I do think it's really important that, like you said, that the back part of the fence has to look like the front side of the fence.
Yes.
And I'm really specific about, let me put you this way. We did a video with a very large Japanese insurance company and we were just about to publish it. And, because my company is still really small, I had to approve it first. And at the end of the day, we filmed in their office, and in a Japanese office, there's always a fixed place for the fire extinguisher. It was on the other side of the window. And then that window was kind of, what's the right word? You couldn't see outside of it, but you could see
So it
the
was
red
like
thing.
a one-way.
No. It was, there's a word for it. I can't remember what it's called.
Is it tinted?
So it's kind of tinted, but it was translucent, but not transparent, right?
Sure.
But you could see through it a little bit. It was like cloudy. I know there's a better word for it, but I can't think of it. And I saw it and I couldn't unsee it. And I can't do low quality work, right? So I actually had the editor figure out a way to create a mask that looked like that window, but took away the red before the other people saw it. So now if anybody listens to this, they'll know that was there. I just have really high standards around like doing the right thing, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but it's everywhere in my life.
It's interesting because I'm very curious about if that is something that is just like certain people are just like this in ways that maybe other people aren't. And it's frankly reminding me of Charlie Munger. And it was really interesting, the amount of time we spent working on Poor Charlie's. In September of 2022, we went to Charlie's house to film an interview with he and John Collison. And one of the very first things that he said was that, often, and he was 99, right? So he spent his whole life with people, and particularly the second half of his life with people asking him about, different ways to make money and so on. And he was adamant throughout his life that not every dollar is equal. And the way that you conduct business was almost more important than anything else. And it was so interesting because he started off that conversation name dropping several companies that he just really did not rate at all because he felt that their way of making money was dishonorable. And you think about this, people who have these principles that they just do not bend or adapt for anything or anyone, and people for whom they apply the principles most strongly to themselves. I will say, the other half of this equation is certainly my particular vice, which is like a bit of self-righteousness. These things are not, universally perfect. I think that is definitely sort of the underbelly of this, like a bit of self-righteousness, maybe sometimes pretension. But I think 99% of the time it comes from a very good place. And it's like a gift to everybody around you when they know that the thing that you are sharing with them is something that, you've taken time on. You didn't cut corners. And I love that you gave that example about the video that you were creating, because there have been multiple times when we've delayed the launch of a book because we didn't think we had the right cover yet. And with any given book, we'll go through dozens of iterations, which is, fair to say. But we have to find the right cover. And sometimes I'll tell you, it feels like, man, like, do we have to do this every time? Do we have to, work ourselves into a tizzy for our next book? We've spent so long trying to figure out the perfect subtitle for that book. And it's so funny because you never hear books referred to with their subtitle. You only say the first part, whatever's before the colon.
Right.
And so I'm sitting here racking my, like, I don't know how many conversations we had about this subtitle, but when you talk about, you know, what it takes to kind of make something that good, that's what it takes. And that's the sort of hard to fake stuff, not the, I guess, whatever people see as signaling. It's that kind of stuff that's unsexy, annoying, frustrating, time consuming for like dubious benefit, it would seem. And I think I've never regretted taking extra time on something. But I have always regretted trying to ship something that I didn't think was quite good enough.
Tamara Winter, the commissioning editor of Stripe Press. I mean, I think we could have done another hour of this, but I think that's the perfect way to end on that sort of principled feeling of, I want to get the right thing done, and I kind of don't care how long it takes. This was awesome. I really appreciate your time. Thank you again so much for doing this.
Thank you. This has been awesome.